Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Keke Coutee, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 17 wide receiver rankings for the 2020 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're going to be covering all things related to the wide receiver position. But before we get into that, I want to talk about some news around the National Football League. There is a lot of news pertaining players that are not going to be playing in Week 17. I mentioned this multiple times already in this week and multiple times throughout the regular season. You do not want to play your championship fantasy game in the final week of the regular season, and this is going to be another reason why. Again, there is going to be 4 to 8 players that we're going to be talking about today that are potentially going to miss, and some that have already confirmed to be missing this upcoming weekend's game. So there's a lot of players that are dealing with injuries that aren't really playing for anything this week. Teams are deciding to go ahead and keep their players healthy for the future and not risk any more re-injury and or requiring of a surgery in the offseason. So after that, of course, we'll talk about matchups of the wide receiver position. We're talking about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR. After we cover that, of course, we're going to be talking about my top 36 wide receiver rankings for this upcoming week. We're going to be talking about players from the top to the bottom. Again, there are a lot of injuries, and this is always going to be subject to change. There are going to be players on today's list, similar to yesterday's video, in which they're not going to play this week, and the rankings are going to be readjusted. Players on their team may get a boost. Players on that team may, get obviously pulled down in the rankings based on if, in fact, they're going to be a number one wide receiver, if they're going to go against tougher coverage. All this kind of stuff factors in. So there's a lot of variables to keep an eye on. Either way, if you're trying to stay up to date, make sure you show up Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'll be doing a live stream for 2 hours, kick off with Keke Coutee before Week 17, answering all questions. I'll have my updated rankings for wide receivers, running backs, quarterbacks, and tight ends by then. So anyway, that is pretty much it. Let's get into this, shall we? We're talking about some news around the National Football League. So I'm going to go ahead and read off a couple players that have already been confirmed to be missing this upcoming week. Then we'll talk about a couple players that, as of right now, could potentially miss, via injury or speculation. So first and foremost, we have the Kansas City Chiefs offense. Patrick Mahomes, Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce. Those are the 3 that are probably confirmed. Sammy Watkins as well, dealing with an injury. He'll definitely miss. Clyde Edwards is going to miss. So practically that entire offense is gone. So I'm not really interested in obviously having any piece of that as of this week. But another big name, and one of the biggest names that probably may hurt a lot of you, Dalvin Cook will be missing this week. James Robinson will be missing his second consecutive week with a knee injury. He's been shut down this season. John Brown has been put on the COVID list along with Cooper Kupp. Those are 2 wide receivers that are potentially going to play a big role in their offense this week, specifically John Brown because of, again, Cole Beasley's dealing with an injury. Brandon Ayuk is being shut down. He is out this week. We have Mike Davis and Christian McCaffrey both missing this week for the Carolina Panthers. That's not the only injury that the Carolina Panthers are dealing with. Also, Robby Anderson missed today's practice. He will be in today's rankings because, again, if he does play, he has great value against the New Orleans Saints defense, but that offense could be missing a lot of pieces. Maybe you should go and pick up their handcuffs accordingly. Also, the last thing I wanted to mention was the 49ers left tackle Trent Williams, formerly of the Washington football team, was traded over again this offseason. He's one of the best left tackles in the National Football League, and he is a huge leader and a huge part of that offense, being able to move the ball on the ground. I think his absence this upcoming week against the Seattle Seahawks will definitely hurt Jeff Wilson Jr.'s overall capability and upside. Again, that is a huge part of that offense. Of course, having Juszczyk and George Kittle as that number 1 and 2 lead block makes a difference, but having a fully healthy offensive line and a functional offensive line makes a huge difference as well. So I think that definitely does hurt his value going against this tough Seattle defense. Okay, that's a lot of information. We haven't talked about injuries and players being confirmed out like that in quite some time, but that's just what Week 17 brings to the table. I mean, that's purely what it is. So now that we've covered that, and now that we've gotten to this point, again, if you have not yet already, click that subscribe button, join the community. We're making fantasy football content again until the end of this season, and in the beginning of next year, we're going to be talking about the NFL playoffs, making content regarding everything 2021. It's going to be an exciting adventure, but we're already getting into the strides of it. As of right now, again, if you could leave the like button down below, comment down below what you guys think about all these injuries. Are you going to be able to survive? Make sure you're hitting the waiver wire and picking up players that are capable of starting and potentially giving you some great upside this upcoming week. All right, let's talk about some matchups of the wide receiver position, beginning with the most advantageous matchups of the week. Of course, we have the Detroit Lions giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers. Again, this hasn't really been something of a surprise. The Detroit Lions have given up 4 touchdowns plus to 4 out of the last 5 matchups that they have played. Deshaun Watson, Aaron Rodgers, Ryan Tannehill, and Tom Brady have all scored 4 touchdowns against them in 4 out of the last 5 games. The Detroit Lions have not been able to stop anybody, and this is a great sign for Kirk Cousins. Again, as of this current moment in time, Kirk Cousins is the number 12 overall quarterback in a 4-point per passing touchdown format with 32 passing touchdowns. A lot of people look at Kirk Cousins and don't, 100% equate him with being a top 12 guy, but that's what he's been this season. He is going to play well, and it's going to definitely obviously allow his top receivers, Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen, to have even more upside this week. A great matchup. We have the Tennessee Titans always giving up a bunch of points. That shouldn't be a surprise either. I think the Houston Texans offense is certainly going to be, functioning as they typically do, scoring a lot of points. The last time these two teams played, it was like a 40-30 matchup. So a lot of high scoring contests. They're just coming off of a shootout themselves. That should be great for the wide receivers there, specifically Brandin Cooks. The Atlanta Falcons, of course, just 2 weeks back, got beat up by Tom Brady in the second half. That should continue for the entire game this time around. The Seattle Seahawks, they're sitting there based on, being grandfathered in. Again, that's another consecutive week in which they haven't given up a receiving touchdown by a wide receiver. I think that's that's like 7 or 8 consecutive weeks that they have been locking down opposing wide receivers. Seattle secondary has been looking great. So again, that's a little bit of a dishonest number, to be honest. We have the Dallas Cowboys, of course, giving up a lot of points. Besides that, Deshaun Jackson, 81-yard touchdown reception. They really just locked down that Eagles offense. They should be able to do the same against Daniel Jones. But either way, the Minnesota Vikings, of course, give up a lot of points, but they're going to be taking on a backup quarterback potentially this week. The Philadelphia Eagles playing against Washington. We don't even know who Washington's quarterback is going to be. Terry McLaurin's probably going to be out. Either way, kind of giving you guys some perspective as to, some of the better matchups at the wide receiver position for sure. Jacksonville, Houston, Cleveland, Tampa Bay. These are always the nice ones. Some of the tougher matchups that we always want to keep an eye on is, of course, the Los Angeles Rams playing well against opposing wide receivers, the Kansas City Chiefs, the Buffalo Bills, the Washington Football Team, the Chicago Bears. Now, the question is going to be this upcoming week. We have the Los Angeles Rams playing against Kyler Murray, who's a little banged up, but again, you have DeAndre Hopkins there. DeAndre Hopkins typically does play well against Jalen Ramsey. But again, where are the other wide receivers in this organization going to kind of pan out? Again, it's going to be tough for them. How about the Kansas City Chiefs? With Keenan Allen potentially out this week, Mike Williams will probably be the number 1 wide receiver. If he's the number 1 wide receiver once again for the second consecutive week, can he produce against the defense? If the defense is starting their full starters, then of course it's going to be tough for them. But we've seen in the past couple years back, Mike Williams has been able to produce as a number 1 guy on this team. I remember a game a couple years back with Phillip Rivers, Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen went out in the game with a concussion, and Mike Williams took over against that Kansas City defense late in the season. So could see it again here in Week 17. The Buffalo Bills, of course, playing well against the opposing wide receivers. So are the Washington Football Team. But either way, just giving you guys some perspective. Now that we've covered that, we can go ahead and we can move on to our top 36 wide receiver rankings for Week 7 of the 2020 fantasy football season. Again, there's a lot of news, man. There's so many things. There's so many different variables that we have to keep an eye on. But luckily for us, the top 12 to 18 wide receivers are guys, maybe even top 24, are guys that we're just automatically starting because they have been fantastic and they have been consistent. And when we get to that 25 to 36 range, that typically is the flex or your wide receiver 3 on your team that you're not certain about. And you have a couple of these guys. Of course, so those are typically the most important ones in order to help you win a week because you expect your main guys to have huge weeks. Now, speaking of having a huge week, Davante Adams is coming off an insane week last week with 3 receiving touchdowns against the Tennessee Titans on Sunday Night Football. And do we expect anything less? Not really. Davante Adams does this for a living. He scores touchdowns and in bunches, to say the very least. He is helping Aaron Rodgers mount the MVP conversation, get him to surpass his most passing touchdowns in his entire career. I mean, it's just unbelievable what Davante Adams has been able to do, regardless of the other wide receivers on the field, regardless of pulling double coverage every single game. He has just been a extra, on another level, to be honest. Like, he is above the rest, the best wide receiver in the National Football League right now in fantasy football. And, of course, captured many of you a championship last week for those of you who are somehow still watching this. But regardless, as of right now, he's certainly going to be the number 1 and continue to be so. We move on to our number 2, DK Metcalf. Okay, so I know DK Metcalf as of late, specifically in the last, I would say 5 to 6 games, has been a little bit underwhelming. But that being said, let's go back and let's see what he did against the San Francisco 49ers earlier this season. Richard Sherman didn't play last week. And even if Richard Sherman does play this week, it's not going to make a difference because DK Metcalf is probably going to destroy that defense. He is going to slaughter them like he did a couple weeks back, in which he put up 2 touchdowns, over 160 receiving yards, double-digit catches. I mean, DK Metcalf is built to dominate that defense. They've done it already this season. And I 100% think that after these last couple of weeks of just being an underwhelming performer, he really is going to have another one of these breakout games in week 17 as they continue to fight for the top of the NFC. So DK Metcalf's my number 2. We have Calvin Ridley as our number 3. It was only 2 weeks back that they played against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and Calvin Ridley had an incredible game. I mean, he had himself, it was a 27-point bomb in a half PPR scoring format. I mean, it just seems to me like the Atlanta Falcons have kind of found themselves in a situation in the last couple weeks where they're competing with the top level teams. They did that at the end of the 2019 season, where they were able to beat the 49ers as the 49ers were on their way to their Super Bowl run. But either way, I think the Atlanta Falcons, they're coached well. They always will continue to fight. Calvin Ridley is the main part of that offense, as of course Julio Jones is going to continue to be out. And I think Calvin Ridley, like he's proven already this season, has himself a pretty good opportunity against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to have himself a great performance here. We have Stefon Diggs as our number 4. The only thing that separated Stefon Diggs from these top-tier wide receivers typically all season long was touchdowns. And he went ahead and he caught himself up a little bit this past week with 3 receiving touchdowns on Monday night against the New England Patriots. I mean, can we ask for anything more? Not really. He plays against the Miami Dolphins, and though the Miami Dolphins secondary is one of the better ones in the National Football League, causing a lot of turnovers, it does not scare me. I honestly do believe Stefon Diggs, he has really established himself as a top-tier wide receiver. He is certainly playing in your offense, but the question remains, what can we anticipate from him? This is a guy that's catching the ball, 10 plus times almost every single week. He's doing this on a consistent basis. 100 yards is just it's the norm at this point. Getting the touchdown, of course, that has always been the coin toss. But if Josh Allen continues to find comfort down in the red zone with him and continues to look in his direction, if Cole Beasley's going to miss, John Brown's going to miss, there is a potential that Stefon Diggs is an even bigger part of this offense and has an even bigger impact overall in fantasy. We have A.J. Brown as our number 5 wide receiver. Now, again, you're playing against the Houston Texans. I mean, you just go back and look at every single game A.J. Brown has participated against the Houston Texans. He scores. That's what he does. He scores against Houston's defense. He puts up fat numbers, and that's just exactly what we anticipate. Regardless of what's going to happen in this contest, Derrick Henry's going to feast. Tannehill's going to be able to, just spread the ball out. A.J. Brown is going to be one of the consistent parts of this offense, and unbelievably so, because Houston does not have a secondary. That's one of the biggest falters that they've had all season long. Besides the fact that they have given up the most rushing yards to opposing running backs this season, their secondary has fallen apart week in and week out. And A.J. Brown will certainly be able to expose that this week as our number 5 wide receiver, another stud play. Of course, Justin Jefferson is the first rookie on the list here for today. I mean, Justin Jefferson has been unbelievable. I really did not anticipate this kind of an explosive year in his rookie year. I mean, obviously coming off of, the year that he had in college, certainly just makes an extra jump in the pro level, playing alongside Adam Thielen and Kirk Cousins, making them even better players himself. But either way, Justin Jefferson, as of right now, plays against Detroit. It is the easiest matchup at the wide receiver position. We've talked about this ad nauseum. And to be honest, he should have himself, at least, like a 6 catch, 100-yard and a touchdown kind of game. That's what I'm anticipating, because that is the minimum requirement when when we're talking about wide receivers against this defense. Let's not forget, last week, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense threw 6 passing touchdowns against that defense. Yes, Dalvin Cook's going to be gone, which will open up the passing game even more, which will rely upon Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen even more. They're going to be fantastic plays this week. We have Mike Evans as our number 7. Mike Evans has had 2 back-to-back incredible weeks. This past week, of course, against Detroit, like we just talked about, had himself 2 receiving touchdowns. The week prior against the Atlanta Falcons, 110 receiving yards. I mean, as I anticipate, Mike Evans is probably coming into this contest with a pretty big chip on his shoulder, trying to continue to just rack up numbers, have his best season of his career, and that's what he's doing. He is proving to everybody that he is still one of these dominant wide receivers. He's getting a lot of targets as of late and definitely delivering upon them. I think, of course, the performance that he had against the Falcons 2 weeks back, he'll continue to build upon it, potentially, attach a touchdown to that and have himself a big week here in week 17. We have Diontae Johnson as our number 8. Now, again, every week, Diontae Johnson is a little bit of a coin toss to an extent. But when I say to an extent, it's mainly because there was only been 1 week in the last, I would say 4 or 5, that has been like, oh man, Diontae Johnson really did screw me over. Because outside of that, Diontae Johnson has been one of the more consistent wide receivers in the National Football League when healthy. I mean, getting 10 plus targets a game, that is just an easy, factor of this offense. Big Ben is looking in his direction. He's the number 1 on that team. Chase Claypool, yes, was relevant early in the season, but with Diontae coming back from his injury, he has been completely evaporated from this offense. So it's Diontae Johnson, number 1. Then, of course, Juju, then Eric Ebron, and then they go ahead and maybe they run the ball once every 10 times. But to be honest, Diontae Johnson has been unstoppable as of late. He's scoring touchdowns. He's getting himself more usage in this offense, more comfort, and hopefully keeping the ball in his hands and it's not hitting the floor as often. Playing against the Cleveland Browns, they got one of the worst secondaries in the National Football League. Whether it's Denzel Ward on him or somebody else, they are still going to be struggling to cover. And I think Diontae Johnson has himself another great week here. Adam Thielen's our number 9. Like I talked about, Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson are certainly going to get a huge boost of productivity and opportunity based on the fact that Dalvin Cook will not be playing. Sure, Alexander Mattison, Mike Boone, there are other running backs in this offense. Amir Abdullah, for all I know, is going to be participating, but it's not going to be the biggest factor of this offense. I think they're going to pass the ball, and I'm certainly, of the belief that Adam Thielen and a Justin Jefferson can certainly get themselves upwards of a touchdown, 100 plus yards, and having themselves a big performance because, again, the secondary can't stop anybody. Whether it's been Davante Adams, whether it's been Mike Evans, Antonio Brown, and Chris Godwin, or it's been a Will Fuller in the last couple weeks, A.J. Brown, it doesn't matter. Corey Davis, everyone has produced against the secondary, and I don't think that these two wide receivers are out of the realm of possibility of having themselves another big week and potentially landing themselves as another duo wide receiver combo in the top 12 wide receivers by the end of the season. We have Allen Robinson as our number 10. Okay, so here's the thing about Allen Robinson. He had himself a pretty good week last week against Jacksonville, but unfortunately didn't score. Getting himself 10 receptions and everything in coming of that with the yardage, I'll take that because especially in a half PPR, full PPR scoring format, that's just beautiful. But the question is, what do we anticipate from him this week? The last time he played against the Green Bay Packers was a lot of garbage time. Got himself 2 receiving touchdowns, and that in itself is probably, kind of, I guess, the outlier. Not often do you end up getting 2 receiving touchdowns in garbage time, but maybe Allen Robinson's kind of, at least tapping back into his days of his Jacksonville Blake Bortles kind of combination with Mitchell Trubisky, who a lot of people call the Blake Bortles of the Midwest. But either way, the whole question is Allen Robinson a relevant enough wide receiver to start this week? I 100% think so. The target count has always been there all season long. He's one of the most targeted wide receivers in the National Football League. Obviously, the quality of targets may not be as high as some of these other wide receivers, but the opportunity is always going to be there. And in a matchup where this team is going to have to pass the ball, certainly, I think Allen Robinson becomes a huge part of this offense. Again, he's always performed well against Green Bay in the last couple of years here in Chicago. Moving on to our number 11, we have Chris Godwin, wide receiver of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So again, like I've mentioned before, they play against the Atlanta Falcons again. Chris Godwin's coming off of a game. Of course, he had himself a receiving touchdown, 9 targets, which was the most in the last couple of weeks. But let's not forget, even against the Atlanta Falcons 2 weeks back, he had himself a receiving touchdown, was a relevant part of this offense. He continues to get more and more of a, chemistry with Tom Brady. I feel like they should already have a chemistry considering he's the slot receiver in this offense and how much Tom Brady loves to target the slot, but it just hasn't clicked 100% all season long. Obviously with Chris Godwin having to miss time with the injury with his finger, his hamstring, all that kind of stuff happening throughout the season. But either way, in the concussion, Chris Godwin's had a tough year, but hopefully he's going to continue to finish strong, have back-to-back weeks of a receiving touchdown and be a big part of this offense. I anticipate that being the case, and that is why I have him as my number 11 wide receiver this week. We're moving on to number 12. Closing out the top 12 wide receivers is DeAndre Hopkins. And though many people are afraid of the Jalen Ramsey experiment and or matchup, it really does not bother me when it comes to DeAndre Hopkins. I've talked about this earlier this season, the first time that these two teams played. DeAndre Hopkins against Jalen Ramsey is typically, 5 to 7 catches, 40 to 50 yards, and a touchdown every single time. And this has been since 2017. If you go back, sure, there are a couple games as outliers in which he doesn't score and a couple games in which he has 100 receiving yard games and a touchdown. So if you just go and you look at the plain average of what he's done against him in his career, he always finds the end zone and he's always a huge part of his offense when playing against a Jalen Ramsey-led defense. So I'm not worried about it. Of course, Kyler Murray's injury and his leg injury is a little concerning, but if he's good to go, I'm not worried about DeAndre Hopkins and I'm surely firing him up. We have DJ Moore as our number 13. Now, I mentioned it before. If Robby Anderson is going to miss, I think DJ Moore is an even bigger play. The last time DJ Moore took on the New Orleans Saints earlier this season, it was a 2-touchdown game, had himself over 100 receiving yards, and that's not the first time he's done that. Go back to 2019. He did that exact same thing against that defense, dominated them, and that has always been the thing. DJ Moore against the New Orleans Saints is automatic success, and we want to see that. We want to have a quarterback wide receiver combination that is always going to continue to succeed against this team. Teddy Bridgewater having himself a little bit of a revenge game per se, but ultimately it's up to DJ Moore and this offense without a stable running game, without McCaffrey, without Mike Davis. They're going to throw the ball the entire time, trying to keep up with New Orleans Saints offense, and I think DJ Moore can certainly have himself a great performance here. We have Amari Cooper as our number 14, coming off of another big game, 121 receiving yards. Obviously, the week prior against the 49ers really did disappear, and it hurt a lot of players. But here's the thing. In fantasy, that is just how the cookie crumbles. Amari Cooper, in my opinion, is still one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League. I cannot wait to see him with Dak Prescott next year. I think that combination is certainly, like they already proven this season, a top 6 wide receiver to quarterback combo in fantasy, and that in itself exciting. But we're talking about this week. We're talking about the matchup against the New York Giants. As it currently stands, I think, of course, there's a question that is James Bradberry going to be on Amari Cooper, or is he going to be on Michael Gallup? Regardless of that, factor, I think the fact that Amari Cooper could produce against Darius Slay the way he did last week kind of continues to diminish the idea that he can't play against number 1 coverage, and hopefully that'll continue to build in the right direction. I mean, he did it earlier this season. He played against Ramsey, and he played lights out, over 100 receiving yards. So again, Amari Cooper has continued to build a wall of success against number 1 wide receivers. I'm not worried about it. I'm for sure firing him up. Brandin Cooks is my number 15. We talked about it last week. Brandin Cooks has not proven to be a stable wide receiver. And my goodness, he came out with an explosive week last week against the Cincinnati Bengals with 25 fantasy points. I mean, did we expect it? Absolutely not, because majority of the offense was ran through a give Chad Hansen the ball, give Keke Coutee the ball, give David Johnson the ball in the passing game. Don't worry about Brandin Cooks. And though that had been, building over the last couple of weeks, it has kind of gotten back in the direction of getting Brandin Cooks the ball. We love to see that, especially once now they take on the Tennessee Titans, one of the more advantageous matchups at the wide receiver position. They give up a bunch of points. I mean, just look at what Davante Adams just did to them on Sunday night. Should be an easy game. I think Brandin Cooks, Deshaun Watson should be a great combo for this week. We move on to our number 16, Marquise Brown. Marquise Hollywood Brown has had 10 plus fantasy points in the last 5 games. Earlier this season, prior to the last 5 games, he has done absolutely nothing. He was not worth anything, and now he has finally found his stride within this offense, as the Baltimore Ravens have ultimately found their stride. As of right now, they're obviously fighting to get into the playoffs. As a 10-5 team, they really struggled this year in comparison to what they did the year prior. But as of right now, what Marquise Brown has been able to do with his level of consistency, finding the end zone in the last couple of weeks with a limited amount of targets, it has given him so much more life and automatically made him a wide receiver 2 in my eyes. And that is why I have him as my number 16. This upcoming week against Cincinnati Bengals, again, we just talked about Brandin Cooks, who is taking the top off of the opposing defense and dominating them. I think Marquise Brown should have himself a pretty good week this week. Moving on to our number 17 wide receiver, we have Juju Smith-Schuster. So here's the thing about Juju. I don't care about him dancing on the logo. I don't care about any of this. All I care about is he getting targets? And the answer is yes. Though there are some weeks that Ben Roethlisberger has not played well, it's ultimately on Big Ben on whether or not Juju Smith-Schuster produces. I mean, again, this is a player that needs a high volume of targets because the average depth of target has not been high enough this season to give him enough viability via receptions and yardage unless you're in a full PPR. Now, that being said, Ben Roethlisberger really did uncork his arm and threw the ball deep this past weekend. There was 2 passing touchdowns, one to Diontae Johnson and one to Juju Smith-Schuster. Smith-Schuster's on a corner route in double coverage. He allowed the receiver to go make the play. That kind of opportunity for wide receivers like this in this Pittsburgh Steelers offense is ginormous in comparison to what this offense was functioning with in the last 3 weeks prior. So again, if they can go ahead, continue on this streak, play against a defense in a secondary that cannot stop wide receivers like the Cleveland Browns can't. Again, earlier this season, they beat the Cleveland Browns 37-7. I think Juju is going to be a big part of this offense this week and a for sure play. We have Antonio Brown as our number 18, coming off of back-to-back weeks of a receiving touchdown. Plays against the Atlanta Falcons, who, again, a couple weeks back had himself a big performance. I think, again, these wide receivers for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are the best core of wide receivers in the National Football League. It is a pure fact. They are unstoppable at this point with Tom Brady in the last 4 quarters having thrown 660-plus yards. I mean, he's just been on fire, and I really cannot see a potential possibility in which they cannot score against the Atlanta Falcons secondary that has been one of the worst in the National Football League. I think AB getting a high volume of targets in comparison to what he was getting earlier this season has found his stride and continues to find himself a part of this offense. We have Jarvis Landry as our number 19. Again, like I talk about with Diontae Johnson and Juju Smith-Schuster, they should be able to succeed against Cleveland secondary. Now, where does that leave the Cleveland Browns offense? They didn't have wide receivers last week. Baker Mayfield surely struggled because of that. The running game definitely did struggle because all you had to do was run commit because they could not pass the ball outside of throwing to the tight end position. So where does that leave Jarvis Landry this week? I think he's going to be targeted double-digit numbers. We're going to see himself, probably catch the ball a lot. The question is he going to be able to accompany his performance with a touchdown and have the upside play? I think that'll be the case. I think this is going to be a higher scoring matchup in the division of obviously two teams that are trying to make the playoffs. One that potentially could be eliminated this week. Another one that is trying to get a higher seeding overall and potentially take the seed over the Buffalo Bills. So if in fact a playoff game is to transpire, they have home field advantage. Either way, I think Jarvis Landry definitely going to come to work. He's definitely going to be a huge part of this offense. I think the entire offense purely will run through him as he's going to be the safety blanket per se of Baker Mayfield this week. Our number 20 for this week is Mike Williams. I mentioned a little bit earlier, Keenan Allen's probably going to be out. And with that being said, Mike Williams is a huge part of this offense. If in fact we have Justin Herbert playing against the second string-esque defense of the Kansas City Chiefs and they're not bringing their huge starters because again, they have a bye week in the beginning of the NFL playoffs and they're going to have a 2-week resting period to allow their defense to get healthy, then why not fire up a Mike Williams, play him against this defense that honestly, if they're down a couple starters, is going to be a shell of themselves. And we could get some, pretty big performances out of these wide receivers of the Los Angeles Chargers. I think Mike Williams is a big part of that. He will be the number one with Keenan Allen down. Seems to me like he's just an upside play that I like a lot. We have Michael Gallup as our number 21. Again, Michael Gallup's coming off of a huge game. Even though his target counts weren't there, 5 targets, 5 catches for 122 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's a big performance. But the biggest thing in my eyes is Michael Gallup scoring 4 touchdowns in the last, 4 games. That in itself is just what kind of entices me to look back in his direction, because I thought to myself, sure, he was catching touchdowns, but is he going to continue to find that kind of success? The touchdowns were making his week, and now that he's getting a high target count or higher target count than usual in comparison to when Andy Dalton first took over this job early in the season, now that he's kind of getting more and more utilization in this offense, especially down in the red zone, it kind of leads me to believe that Michael Gallup could be an offensive threat here against the New York Giants. That yes, that secondary has been playing better this season in comparison to years past, but could be a threat in which he could score once again, have himself a pretty good week here in fantasy. That is why Michael Gallup sits at 21. We have Robby Anderson at 22. Like I mentioned earlier, he could miss. He's dealing with an injury, but if he doesn't, I think against the New Orleans Saints, he's had himself some pretty good performances as of late. I mean, we're talking about a guy that has a baseline floor of like 7 to 8 catches, 70 to 80 receiving yards. If you accompany that with a touchdown, similar to what he did last week, I think he scored 2 touchdowns in the last 4 games specifically, which obviously makes a pretty big difference considering he's only scored 3 receiving touchdowns this year. Robby Anderson is a guy that is safe, but also has the upside ability of a deep passing guy. Also can, just run around and find himself open because Teddy Bridgewater's always looking in his direction. So if he's on the field and he's ready to go, I'm for sure firing him up. We have Jamison Crowder as our number 23 wide receiver this week. So Jamison Crowder, besides the fact that he threw a touchdown to Braxton Berrios, he got himself 9 targets. That in itself, accompanied with the receptions, the yardage, and the receiving touchdown, leads me to believe that Sam Darnold's back on the Jamison Crowder train. No better time to do so, especially considering we're going into a Week 17 matchup against an offense and a defense in the New England Patriots that cannot stop anybody. It does not matter what you tell me. That team is a shell of itself in comparison to what they've been in the past. I think Jamison Crowder, for sure a great play, can get back to what he did earlier this season of getting himself a high target count, good amount of receptions for a PPR, half PPR sense, and then have himself a touchdown upside. It just seems to me like that's just an automatic bread and butter play. We have Robert Woods as our number 24. Now, here's the thing. Robert Woods is incredible against the Arizona Cardinals. In the last 3 games that he's played against them, he has had incredible numbers. But without Jared Goff at quarterback, what can we anticipate here? I think, of course, we're going to get a lesser performance. But on top of that, he is literally the only wide receiver in that offense that I trust. With Cooper Kupp going out, getting put on the IR list, I mean, are we anticipating Robert Woods to be the only guy getting targeted? Probably. This might be the case. He's played well against Patrick Peterson in the past, and as long as this quarterback, whoever it may be, is going to funnel him the ball, he's going to find success here. I leave him at this fringe wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 spot because, again, it is sketchy when you're talking about a backup quarterback and relying upon them. Number 25 for this week is CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. So, again, this is the 3rd Dallas Cowboy wide receiver we're going to talk about. Again, there's a lot of wide receiver cores in the National Football League, like specifically the Tampa Bay Buccaneers or the Carolina Panthers or the Dallas Cowboys that have 3 relevant wide receivers, and we have to talk about them every single week because they're continuing to produce. And CeeDee Lamb, he himself is coming off of another great performance. These are back-to-back weeks in which he's having himself good games in good matchups. I think the matchup against the New York Giants, that itself is a pretty advantageous one. I think CeeDee Lamb getting himself a high volume of targets. Obviously, we'd like to see him get more targets, but there are so many viable options in this offense that are pulling it away from him. Regardless, continues to be a fantastic option as a wide receiver 3 and sits here at my number 25. We have Nelson Agholor coming off of a week in which he had 150 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, 5 catches. I mean, Nelson Agholor has been the most inconsistent and consistent wide receiver at the same time. Inconsistent in the fact that every other week he's kind of good, but consistent in the fact that, yeah, we can anticipate that every other week he's going to be good. So with Derek Carr coming back, it's giving me a little bit more excitement on the potential of him this week. Playing against the Denver Broncos, a defense that in their secondary, yes, they haven't given up a lot of touchdowns this season, but they're definitely capable of doing so. I think the last time these two teams played, Nelson Agholor wasn't a big part of the offense because the running game really dictated the entire offense for the Las Vegas Raiders. I think if Nelson Agholor and or Derek Carr are in need of points, they're going to connect and they're going to find themselves in the end zone. I think Nelson Agholor is a pretty good player as a number 26. Number 27 is Zach Pascal. So here's the thing. This Colts wide receiver is not T.Y. Hilton, but the reason why I have him on the list is because the way that Phillip Rivers has specifically functioned this year, he finds a wide receiver or a tight end or a running back, and he funnels them the ball for multiple weeks in a row. He did that earlier this season with Trey Burton, with Mo Alley-Cox, with Jack Doyle, with T.Y. Hilton, and now we are on the Zach Pascal train. Like, this is the time. He's had back-to-back weeks of a receiving touchdown. 2 weeks back had himself 2 receiving. So 3 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. I think Zach Pascal could easily, this upcoming week against the Jacksonville Jaguars of all secondaries, score himself a touchdown and find himself as a very relevant wide receiver 3. Again, he's on, this little bit of a heat up and has found himself the hot hand in this offense. And Phillip Rivers continues to look in his direction as he's on the field majority of the time. Russell Gage is my number 28. And though many people struggled with the idea that, yes, Russell Gage did not produce last week, Russell Gage, luckily for himself, will be able to bounce back in a very advantageous matchup. Just go look at the last 3 games that he's played against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He's averaging 10 targets against them in the last 3 contests. Last season in 2019, his 2 best performances was against this defense. Again, 2 weeks back, playing against Tampa Bay, scored himself a touchdown, had himself great targets, catches, and receiving yards. Ultimately, I think this is a potential where he can certainly get himself into that 15-point fantasy mark, but also is a safe 10-point play on a weekly basis at this point. So for sure, I'm playing him as my number 28. Number 29 is Corey Davis, another wide receiver that did not perform well, but we have to rely upon because, again, we're not going to shun them because of one bad performance. I think, Corey Davis in the last month, and just to be honest, the entire year has been a very good wide receiver than what he's been in the past. And even though he did not score a single point this past week on Sunday Night Football against the Green Bay Packers, I'm not going to shun him away. I think he will be relevant, specifically against the Houston Texans of all defenses. I mean, that matchup, he didn't get to play against them earlier this season as he was on the COVID list, but I think Corey Davis certainly will be able to perform and have himself a pretty good week here as my number 29. Number 30 is Cole Beasley. If he doesn't end up playing, Gabriel Davis will be in this top 36 conversation without a doubt in my mind with John Brown on the COVID list. So again, if Cole Beasley's leg injury is bad enough to where it's permitting him from being able to run and be the Cole Beasley that they need him to be, then I anticipate putting Gabriel Davis in this conversation. But for as of right now, whoever the number 2 wide receiver is in this offense is typically going to see at least 8 to 10 targets. In that kind of formula, I think when you're playing against the Miami Dolphins, the tight end position is not very relevant unless your name is Darren Waller. And then you have yourself the running back position, kind of hard to run the ball. You might be able to just very easily throw the ball against this team, take advantage of what your main advantage is, which as of right now is Josh Allen. Feed the ball to Stefon Diggs and then the number 2 wide receiver. If Cole Beasley's there and in full form, I think he's certainly a great play this week. We move on to Curtis Samuel. This is the 3rd wide receiver on the Carolina Panthers that we want to talk about today because, again, they're going to be throwing the entire time. I think because they won't have a running back that, in my opinion, is a stable guy to 100% feed the ball to, I think Teddy Bridgewater is going to have to pass the entire game. So also because, again, you're playing against the New Orleans Saints. They stop the run for a living. So as of right now, Curtis Samuel should be a huge part of that offense, could get himself some snaps at the running back position, and we'll see a high volume of targets because he typically plays in the slot. Honestly, Curtis Samuel, not a bad play this week. We have T.Y. Hilton, another wide receiver from the Colts, who I think should be able to produce because, again, they play against the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jacksonville Jaguars have given up a ton of points to opposing wide receivers, running backs, quarterbacks, tight ends. It does not matter. Their defense has been one of the worst and in the bottom 5 of literally every single category all season long. So I think T.Y. Hilton, regardless of a little bit of a slower path in the last 2 weeks, he's scoring about 7 to 9 points in the last 2 weeks in fantasy. I think he'll get back to potentially even scoring a touchdown and getting himself into that 13, 14-point role if, in fact, he can find himself in there. Again, he very easily could because this offense should be scoring at least 30 points against Jacksonville. We have Keke Coutee as the number 33. As the number 2 wide receiver of the Houston Texans, he should have, at least see himself a good amount of targets against Tennessee, mainly because Tennessee can't stop anybody. I mean, Keke Coutee is going to run around. He's going to see the second most volume of targets besides Brandin Cooks. And even if Brandin Cooks doesn't get the high volume of targets, it's going to go to Keke Coutee then. Because again, Coutee, prior to this past week, was a relevant option for 3 consistent weeks, 141 receiving yard games against the Indianapolis Colts. Then had himself a touchdown against the Bears, a touchdown against the Colts again. And to be honest, I just see like this is just a matchup that you have to play wide receivers against because it should be a higher scoring one in which Deshaun Watson is putting up numbers. And of course, a guy like Coutee should be able to benefit from. Number 34 for this week is Sterling Shepard. And the only reason he's on this list is because he plays the Dallas Cowboys. That's it. Literally, that is it. I think wide receivers against the Dallas Cowboys, even though in the last couple of weeks they haven't found that much success. We've seen Brandon Ayuk. We've seen Deshaun Watson. We've seen wide receivers produce against this team. Sterling Shepard, if he's going to get those targets, can certainly put up points. Tyler Lockett's kind of been forgotten, and therefore I thought about leaving him off the list, but I'll put him at 35 just to kind of respect Tyler Lockett for what he has done this season for us. Thank you, Tyler Lockett, for your contribution for those 2 games that you had massive performances. Outside of that, we'll talk about you next season. All right, then we have Marvin Jones Jr. Regardless of who's playing at quarterback, he's going to be the number 1 wide receiver of this offense playing against the Minnesota Vikings, who they themselves have struggled in the secondary. I could very easily see Marvin Jones playing against the secondary and putting up pretty big numbers. He is my number 36. Those are my top 36 wide receiver rankings for Week 17 of the 2020 fantasy football season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until tomorrow when we'll talk about tight ends, I'll see you guys. Peace.